welcome to the CDG BizCast. I'm your host, Christian Gonzalez, owner of Creativity Design Group, a digital marketing firm in Houston, Texas. Today, we're unlocking the secret to building teams that actually take initiative. My guest is Dr. Matthew Wilson, leadership expert, founder of the Ownership Academy, and author of Ownership Unlocked, 4 Principles to Build Self-Driven Teams that Take Initiative, Innovate, and Win. With 20 plus years in Fortune 500s and academia, he's developed a proven framework to turn passive teams into proactive powerhouses. If you want your people to think like owners, solve problems, and stay committed for the long haul, this episode is your playbook. Welcome, Matthew. It's a pleasure to have you on CDG BizCast. It's also an honor to have you on as well. I look forward to learning so much about taking ownership over projects, and I know that you have a lot to share with the entrepreneurship world, all of our listeners, about this topic, because it is a major problem that people do fail to truly own the work that's put in front of them that they're paid to do.
Well, hey, Christian, yes, so grateful to be here. I'm excited to talk to you and your audience and looking forward to our conversation today. The honor is really mine to be here. So thanks for having me on the pod.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Let's go ahead and get started learning more about yourself and Ownership Academy. Please tell us about why you founded Ownership Academy and what prompted you to make a difference in the professional world in terms of how people view their work.
Yeah, I'd be happy to give you that background. So I grew up in a corporate world where sometimes I was actually taking a little too much ownership of projects, but I was always fascinated by working with others that just really seemed checked out. And I didn't really understand them. I mean, they showed up for work, they were not really engaged, and I was always very frustrated about that. And so I had kind of a typical corporate career. I started out in investment banking, got an MBA after that, did marketing, product management for some major Fortune 500 companies. I eventually felt called to go into academia. And so when I was getting my PhD, one of the things that you have to do as a new PhD student is pick a topic that you're going to really dive deep into. And this topic of psychological ownership really fascinated me. And so I spent the majority of my time at Baylor University digging deep into the topic of psychological ownership and trying to uncover, both from a philosophical and a psychological perspective, why is it that some people take ownership in their work and some people don't? And, that project racked up. I wrote my dissertation, all was well. But then I kind of had an experience that happened to me after getting my PhD that really was the triggering point for making me want to write this book. And I went up to Harvard for a couple of years. I helped launch a program up there called the Human Flourishing Program. But then I came to a much smaller university after that. I'm going to not say their name just for discretion. But at that university, I really saw people's sense of ownership being crushed, sort of like on a daily basis, including my own. And I got to a point where, like I said, I was naturally someone who loved to take ownership in their work. And I was feeling very disengaged, very sort of distant from my work myself. And I knew that I had spent all this time studying psychological ownership. And I was just seeing repeated behavior and policy and management style over and over and over again. And I was like, you know what? I've got to do this. I know there's tons of other organizations out there, tons of other small businesses out there. While they want peak performance out of their employees, they're oftentimes inadvertently or accidentally doing stuff that just kills people's sense of ownership, or at least it doesn't inspire it the way it could. And so I started out on a multi-year project while I was still working as a professor to kind of figure out how to translate that psychology literature and my dissertation work into real, practical, tangible, day-to-day principles that an everyday business owner could use. And so I started workshopping with different companies. I was working with management teams. Gradually, as I was writing the book, trying out different things, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't. And after about 2.5 years of sort of going through that process, I finally was able to finish the book, and it launched really earlier this year. So I've been really excited about that. Alongside the book, I launched what I have named the Ownership Academy. So we provide training to people who are interested in figuring out how they can lead for ownership. Really, my signature product is a day-long workshop that I do with management teams, sort of like an intensive that, a lot of people don't have time to read a whole book on this stuff. And they're just kind of like, get me to the sauce. And so I started the Academy as a way to sort of complement these principles that I was able to write up in the book. And that's kind of what that's about.
I see. So yes, it was basically several years of studying and observation that culminated into you writing this book, basically. You're now able to point out the exact problem where people fail to take true ownership of their work. You're able to point them out, outline them, and then help employees and supervisors both foster a sense of ownership in the workplace now.
Yeah, that's correct. I think most leaders, business business owners or just, everyday middle managers, they know that they want the people that they're leading to take ownership in their work. And they're trying to figure out how to do this. One of the more popular terms that has been popularized actually by the Gallup organization is the idea of employee engagement. What does it mean for employees to be engaged in their work? And they sort of define engagement as bringing your whole self to work, or there's sort of different definitions that float around there. But I really saw sort of a missing piece sort of in the leadership literature, which is how do we really inspire ownership and what does it mean to own your work? And so while leaders, they kind of have this sense that they want people to take ownership in their work, very few people actually understand what ownership is and what the psychology behind ownership is. And if you really start to understand that, then you can think of a whole host of practical, tangible sort of management techniques that you can use to encourage your employees to really take ownership in their work. So I hope that's something we can maybe discuss next.
That's exactly what I would like to talk about next, specifically the 4 keys of ownership that you discuss in your book. I found the 4 keys very fascinating. I've never seen ownership of a project through this lens before, so I too have developed a completely different outlook on what it means to truly have psychological ownership whenever I work on any project. In fact, it's allowed me to reflect back on my past and realize why I was not able to truly get a sense of ownership of projects I worked on when I was in the corporate world. That all changed when I left the corporate world to become a business owner, but we'll discuss that more later. But yes, please share with our listeners more about what the 4 keys to ownership are and why they are important for career success.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to. So before we dive into the 4 keys, I think it's important to first define what ownership is. And it's when we look at a work project and we think of it as truly mine or ours. And in that, seeing a work project, whether that's a new marketing campaign, whether it's the business kind of as a whole thought of a project, when we see that as mine and ours, what we're really doing on a psychological level is we're seeing as a part of ourselves in it. Psychologists call this an attachment or self-identification. Both words are kind of similar. And what happens is when we invest our creativity and our time and our effort into something, we start to see it as mine and ours, and we become attached to it. And so attachments are very common in human life. We become attached to our children. If we're parents, children become attached to their parents or their primary caregiver. But we can become attached to like simpler things too, like our favorite baseball team that we root on every week, or even something as simple as my favorite coffee cup. I can kind of develop a special attachment to that, or to animals, places, all sorts of things. Well, ownership is one form of attachment. And so in order for me to become invested in my work or attached to my work and see it as mine, there's 4 psychological keys that have to be turned in order for that to happen. In order to explain this, when I'm teaching folks, I really like to use this sort of parable or story of how a young man who might be turning 16 would take ownership in a car that he's given for his birthday for the very first time. So you might imagine that a dad goes out, buys a car for his son and titles it in the son's name, and it's kind of hidden away until the day of his birthday. Well, legally, that son is already an owner, but psychologically, he's not. And so that's an important principle to realize that just because, maybe you give your employees some kind of legal or financial stake in a company, that doesn't actually mean that they've taken psychological ownership yet. But when we think through the process of, well, what would it mean for that son to actually take psychological ownership of the car that he's being given, there's 4 keys that happen. And if we just walk through that process slowly, we can see each of them at play. So the first key is the invitation, or sometimes I'll call it the offer of ownership. And what happens is the dad is like, happy birthday, son. I want to invite you to take ownership of this car. Here it is. I'm offering it to you. And ownership in psychological studies has been shown to be a socially communicated sort of psychological phenomenon. You can imagine if we were living on an island by ourselves, the whole concept of ownership actually wouldn't even make that much sense. We own things into relation to others. And so when we're given ownership, we need to be invited or offered that ownership. The second key is acceptance. So just because the dad offers the son ownership, there's no actual guarantee that the son will accept it from a psychological standpoint. Well, you might think, why wouldn't the son accept it? Well, maybe he looks at the car and he's like, man, that thing is a real clunker. I'm not driving that around. There's no way I'm letting the girls see me in that. Or maybe it's, I have a broken relationship with my dad and I'm not going to take anything from you. But just because an invitation to ownership is made doesn't mean that's necessarily accepted. In order to accept something as ours, as mine, design, I have to see the thing as good or worthwhile, sort of intrinsically. And so this will become very important later when we talk about how, business owners and managers can inspire ownership. We need to make sure that worthwhileness of the work or the project is seen. The third key is what I call influence. So influence just means that we have some ability to exert our influence or our control or shape the direction or the outcome of a project. In this case of the son and the dad, you could imagine a scenario where, okay, I've given the son the car, the son has accepted it, but then every time the son wants to take the car out for a drive, dad's like, no, or you can only go here, or just basically takes away all control. And the son would at that point think, well, why do I even own this car? I mean, inherent in the concept of ownership is this idea that we can at least influence the projects or the things that we're working on. I think influence is a better word than control, primarily because in the work context, nobody actually controls everything, even really the CEO. I mean, I think good CEOs realize that they can't get anything done without other people. And so what their job then becomes is to influence and shape the direction of things. And the fourth key is intention. So when you think about the fundamental concept of ownership, one thing that is intrinsic in the concept is that we have a future intention to do something or participate in the project or the thing that we're owning in the future. So in this case of the son and the dad, you could imagine that if there ever came a point where the son didn't have any more intention to use the car, let's say he went off to New York City to college, and so he's got no more use for the car. Well, at that point, he's going to detach psychologically. He's no longer going to be taking ownership in that car, invested in it, invest in its upkeep, its maintenance, that kind of thing. He's going to be disengaged because he doesn't have any intention to use it again in the future. And so this is really important too, in terms of the workplace context, because the classic example of this, of course, that we all know is what people sometimes refer to as short-timer syndrome. So you've put in your 2-week notice. You now have a firm intention actually not to stay a part of that project anymore in the future. And so it's almost impossible to maintain your sense of ownership, that sense that it's mine, because again, we always have to remember that what ownership is this kind of attachment or self-identification with the work that we're doing. And if I can't see myself doing that, at least for some medium term, I mean, you don't have to intend to be with a company for the rest of your life to still have a meaningful intention to work. But the minute that we know, hey, I'm out of here, man, that attachment, that sense that it's mine, it really shuts off. Those are sort of the 4 keys to ownership. And when you kind of peer down into the leadership or the management context, each key, we can take specific actions to try to turn as we lead other people. First, to invite them to take ownership in their work, to get them to accept the ownership that we're inviting them to make sure that they have real influence over the projects, because without influence, there's not going to be any ownership. And then also to make sure that they intend to stay, because if they're not intending to stay, then they're not going to be owning things either.
Right. And in certain cases, it certainly does make sense to start detaching when you know that you're no longer going to be part of that project. Like you said, if you put in your 2-week notice to resign. Another example that comes to my mind as you told me this one was, think about HOAs and homeowners. Mm-hmm. The homeowners own their homes, but then the HOAs put a lot of restrictions on what they can do to the appearances of their home. So in a way, that's kind of similar to the example you gave about the dad buying his son a car, but telling him that he can only drive that car to certain places.
Yeah. So there has to be some degree of influence, I think, is the thing for someone to maintain their sense of ownership. Yeah, your homeowners association is certainly going to limit what you can do, but I don't think that necessarily prohibits you from taking ownership, psychological ownership in your home and its upkeep and its maintenance. But the more and more restrictive and the less and less influence you feel like you have, then yeah, ultimately you will sort of detach. So I think any kind of organization has to put some processes and guardrails around how work gets done. And so there's always inherently going to be a kind of tension in the business context in terms of how much influence you can let your employees have and like sort of give them free rein versus having specific processes in place to make sure that work gets done to, a standard operating procedure or to a high quality. So,
right. I wanted to share with you a very quick story. Now, this is not related to the micromanaging story I'll be sharing with you later, but this is when I was working at a previous job of mine from 10 years ago. I can't give too many details about where I worked or what I did, but I worked at a production facility. And being that I'm in the graphic design field, I had to prepare artworks that were going to be placed on these items that we were producing. Mm-hmm. So this meant taking taking the artwork that customers sent in and making it print ready so that it could be printed on certain items. Well, I noticed that a certain item that a customer was ordering that they wanted the artwork placed on was out of stock. The specific item they were looking for was out of stock, and the assistants who were in charge of ensuring the inventory was kept up out on the production floor were nowhere around. So I stepped away from my workstation to the inventory area, which was right outside the door to my office. Now, one thing I need to mention is that my supervisor at this company was extremely hot-headed, bossy, never wanted to hear what anybody had to say, and if you tried to explain to him your reasoning over something you did, he would just say, I don't want to hear it, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute.
I'm sorry you had to deal with that. That's a really bad experience.
Yeah, I hated working there. The guy was a bully. You're about to find out exactly why I didn't like dealing with him and how he killed my attempts to take ownership of this problem. So I stepped out the door to go look and see if I could find any of these items that were in stock. As I mentioned, the inventory's right outside the door. And then he comes up to me and he's like, Christian, what are you doing? I told him, I need to make sure that this item's in stock because a customer's ordering. He goes, I need you in that room working on those artworks. I told him, well, I need to find out if this is in stock. They ordered one that's out of stock. He goes, then ask the guys to find out for you. And I told him, they're not around. He goes, they're around where they always are when I asked him where they're at. But you see, I was just trying to make sure that this customer was taken care of. And he just decided he wanted to come out all steamed up and upset over this just because I wanted to make sure the customer was taken care of. He just immediately killed that sense of ownership because he was a narcissistic control freak. He was one of those bosses who basically believes you're going to shut up, you're going to obey me, and you're going to kiss my feet.
Yeah, boy, I'm really sorry that happened. So as I hear you talk, I see a couple things. One that I think is really interesting is that nobody told you to actually go and check that inventory and that kind of thing. Like there was something in you that naturally sort of wanted to take ownership in that. That was sort of your human drive, was to like make this right. And this is one thing that I argue for extensively, is that I think it's wired into our DNA that when we are at work, whatever we're doing, if we're building a project at home or at work, you're doing your creative designs there in the story that you just told, it's like you have a propensity and you want to take ownership in your work. And so that's what you were doing. And unfortunately, what your boss did was not only did he not invite you to take ownership, but he uninvited you and essentially killed your sense of ownership then, because what he essentially said is, stay in your lane, don't take ownership in this way. And so that what happens with people at work is then they form a belief that I'm not supposed to take ownership. I'm not supposed to, try to proactively contribute to what's going on, even if it's not my responsibility. I mean, that's literally like the sign of someone who's taking ownership at work, is when they're willing to do things that aren't technically a part of their responsibility. They're willing to go over and above. They're willing to, do whatever it takes to make sure that the project that they're working on succeeds. Well, why? Because they're invested in it. They want it to happen. And so, yeah, that's really unfortunate that happened. That manager could have been motivated from, any number of reasons, including just fear, fear-based management of not knowing, fear of loss of control of his team, or, there's a lot of sort of maladaptive psychological sort of mechanisms that we as humans can develop over time. But that's one of the things I think it's important to bring awareness to, is like, hey, if you want your team to take ownership, then two things need to happen. One, you need to invite them to do that. And in inviting them to take ownership, you need to kind of paint a picture for what that looks like. This story you have would actually be a great story for demonstrating to whoever's the graphic designer on your team to, what does taking ownership look like? Hey, you're designing something and you realize there's a problem, and that problem is in inventory and not in graphic design. Well, you raise the problem, you try to fix it. That's a great example of what taking ownership actually looks like. And making sure that those invitations that you make then aren't ineffective because on the back end, you prohibit people from actually taking the liberty to influence and control the projects and solve things on their own. I mean, essentially, that's what ownership is. It's solving things on your own. I mean, there's different ways to put it, but I think that's a great one.
Good leaders know how to inspire their team to take ownership, whenever unfortunate events like this happen. And unfortunately for him, he was just too much of a control freak. Like I said, he is one of those types of bosses who get angry and upset over the tiniest of things. The easiest way to get him angry was to tell him he was wrong about something, because then he would go, I don't want to hear it. And that was only one of many encounters I had with him, because I had to endure him every day. He was always like that every day, getting upset over who knows what. There was even a time where I ended up in his office for nearly 45 minutes to an hour because he was chewing me out over some ordeal. But that's a story I'm going to save for when I do my episode on toxic bosses. That episode is to be announced later. But, based on what I've witnessed witness. This is just one of many stories that has driven me to leave the corporate world and start my own business where I don't have to deal with any of that nonsense anymore. I've always told people that I never had a boss that I've liked working for. The only boss I ever had that I liked working for was myself. And I did not like how he always flew off the handle over small things. And I just wanted to make sure that this order was taken care of, because here's the thing. He got upset with me for going out there to look. But if I didn't produce the order because I didn't know if that item was in stock, he would have also gotten upset with me for that too. And he would have blew his top majorly over that as well. So what do you do when you get in trouble for taking ownership, but you also get in trouble because you don't take ownership?
Communication is key, and you've got to be able to explain, what you were doing and why. And, but I don't know. I mean, there's certain people that are so bad, that's not even going to work. How many people do you manage now, Christian?
I'm a solopreneur, so I do everything.
Okay, great. You don't have to worry about being the boss that you always wish you had.
Right, because I am my own boss and I get to basically decide how things are going to get done. And when it comes to my clients' projects, because, web design, graphic design, and other projects in between here and there, being that I'm the solopreneur, I have no choice but to take full ownership for these projects. And in fact, I've got another example that I could share with you too, where back in 2013, I was doing an internship for a small company that specialized in web and graphic design, similar to my company, only, of course, that company did not have good leadership. He completely did not allow me to take any ownership when it came to making sure things were done right. So here's basically how it worked. I basically had to please the boss before he would even attempt to please the client. And I found this messed up because as an intern, I was not allowed to participate in any client meetings. He had to go to all of them and talk with the client. The other employees would get to go, but I had to be excluded from them. So anytime I needed to know what the client wanted, I wasn't allowed to talk to the client. I had to talk to the boss, and it was basically him telling me what he wanted, not what the client wanted. So basically I'm pleasing him, not the client. So I have to work on websites. At the time, it was just building websites, and I could never really get anything done because he criticized every website that I did. And keep in mind, I was only a student in college back in 2013, an Art Institute student studying web design. So my work wasn't the best, but it wasn't bad either. And there was just no pleasing the guy. So basically, he did not allow me to take ownership in the correct sense. How was I supposed to be able to produce a good project if I didn't know what the client wanted, if it was always all about pleasing him? He was extremely narcissistic. He was very opinionated, and he is just another boss that I unfortunately had to deal with, but it was only for a short time. That came before the previous story I shared. This was at a different company back in 2013, and the last example was 2014. But you see what I mean?
Well, and what you were just talking about there, I mean, so good leaders that know how to lead for ownership understand that part of helping people take ownership in projects involves that they see the good and the worthwhileness of the work that they're doing and see what the end goal is. And so there's no better way in your intern situation to convey that as to have you actually be there with the client that you're ultimately serving. And what is the good that you're trying to do? What are they trying to do? What's their mission? And, you hear a lot of leaders talk about mission, vision, and values. And those are so important on so many different dimensions. But the way I always like to think about those is how important they are in understanding the worthwhileness of your work, because we can't take ownership in work that we don't think is truly worthwhile at some level. And I mean, I'm sure even as a solopreneur, you've probably encountered this. I mean, there's probably some clients that you have where you really connect with like what the mission is of what they're doing or what they're trying to achieve in the world. And it kind of gives you that little extra excitement, and which is a kind of investment or attachment to what it is they're doing. And you want to see them succeed. And other projects, maybe that's less clear. And so it's a little harder to get invested in that kind of work. And so that's that principle of acceptance that a good leader will help communicate the goodness and the why of why we're doing this work and help reframe specific parts of the work. We can't all be the ones who are maybe, delivering that final presentation to the client or whatever, but making sure that even everyone under us, including the interns, sees how their work contributed to the final project and then passing that feedback down. Like, man, it went so great and you were a part of this. And even if they couldn't have been there, for instance, if you in the final pitch or the final presentation of the new website or the new marketing initiative or whatever that was.
Right, to take stronger ownership of their projects. Basically, this falls onto two things I read about in your book. The first thing is that whenever you tell your team that they did a job well done, especially if you're talking to individual team members, it does give them a stronger sense of ownership because it makes them feel good knowing that their contributions actually were a success. And secondly, you also mention in your book that good leaders will give their team access to materials that owners need. So So in my case, this material would have been actually getting firsthand knowledge from the client about what they specifically wanted. Because personally, I found it to be extremely narcissistic for the boss to basically say, you have to please me before you can please the client. Because the boss himself, he may have a general idea of what the client wants, but the client is the one that I really need to talk to. To me, that was just him just trying to make himself seem very domineering, as if, no, you're my intern. I don't want you talking to my clients. You're going to please me before I even think about trying to please my clients, because you don't work for them. You work for me. That's basically how I translate it.
Yeah. I mean, both points are great. I think praising people, not only just for their work effort and showing them how their contribution matters, but also specifically praising them for when they take ownership. I mean, you want to sort of reinforce the behavior, and that's a kind of re-inviting them to take ownership. So if I see you take ownership in some specific way, and then I praise you for that, either to your face or even better at a team meeting, so that other people see that this is praiseworthy behavior, that's kind of like a way of inviting everybody back to take ownership. And then, you sort of address the boss wanting you to, I guess, perform for him, not before anyone else. That may be a case of where he's failing to see the project as ours. So, in my book and in my research, one thing I talk about is taking ownership is good most of the time, but there are these maladaptive cases where we become overly possessive of a project and we see it as mine, but we're starting to fail to recognize that actually this is a group effort and that the contributions of others matter, and that there's other quote owners in the project too that also want and need their influence. And so it's important as a leader to really keep sight of the fact that like every project you're leading is something that is ours. It's not just mine. So if something is ours, then it's also mine, but something can be mine without also being ours. And so that inclusivity, that sense of ours is important to keep sight of. And so maybe a more mature manager of an intern in the story that you cited would see the need for you to have your influence and you to be more connected to the project, and would see you as integral to the common project, which is ours, not just like, he was probably overly developed his own sense of like, this is my project that I'm delivering to the client. And, I don't want anyone else to be seen, so great leaders, of course, want other people to be seen and want other people's work to be recognized. And that requires, of course, humility and a certain confidence in yourself that not everyone has. So.
Right. I just felt that he had too much pride and he was too pompous to show off the work that an intern did. So, I mean, that's just one other theory that I have. I don't know for sure if that's true, but what is true is that the guy was extremely narcissistic. I wouldn't call him a hothead, but he was extremely rude. I will throw that out there for the record. Now, the next thing I want to ask you about relates to this. So as you know, our audience is mainly those in the entrepreneurship world. Now, I know that there isn't one definite answer to this question, and I know it also depends on a variety of different factors, but in simplest terms, how can aspiring entrepreneurs as well as seasoned business owners both take better ownership of their own projects whenever they struggle to do so? Even though they know for sure that those projects are theirs, they still kind of struggle to maintain ownership over them for a variety of reasons. And how can they also encourage their employees to do the same?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, probably best answered in two parts. Do you mind clarifying maybe what you have in mind when you say that they are struggling to take ownership of their own projects? Maybe just an example or two, just so I make sure we're on the same page.
So let's say we have a baker. He has a big order. He's going to be catering several cupcakes to a major event. However, he is not a fan of making large orders, even though he offers them because he knows there's money in them. He is struggling to truly be driven to really work on this order. Like, he knows it's his order and that it's his project, but he's struggling to get a sense of ownership over it because psychologically he's not happy with it. So his own unhappiness is preventing him from truly feeling like an owner, and therefore he's not exactly performing his best. He's not getting the cupcakes pumped out on time, and he knows the deadline's coming up and he has to work faster. But because he is so bogged down by the fact that he has to do this order, it's keeping him from truly enjoying his work and feeling like that he owns this project. Maybe on top of that, the client is very demanding too. So that also is a second factor keeping him from having ownership over it.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Thanks for that as an example. Well, in the baker example that you just said, if we think through the 4 keys of ownership, just to review them real quickly, we have the invitation. I think in this case, there's no inviting. He's accepted the order. He owns it. So like, we're good there. There's acceptance, which has to do with seeing the good and the worthwhileness of the work. There's influence, which obviously he's the baker, so he's got all the influence here. So I don't think we need to worry about that key as much. And then there's intention, which is that future orientedness. And so I think this is something that I would, diagnose this scenario as there's an internal resistance to this work. Why? Because it's hard, it's tedious, maybe it's repetitive because it's a large order and it's making the same cupcake over and over and over and over again. And there's less creativity involved in it and that kind of thing. And so possibly if I was coaching this person, I would suggest, let's get back to like why you got into this business in the first place and what it is that your cupcakes or your cakes or whatever he's baking, what does it do to people? Like, how does it help them? How does it change their lives? Does it make them more productive? Well, no. Does it make them, skinny? No. Does it bring them joy? I mean, when you're biting into that cupcake or where, we don't know what the event is, and trying to reconnect yourself with sort of the why of, and imagining how this is impacting your customer and seeing, okay, even though it's repetitive, it's still worthwhile and it's still worth doing, and sort of trying to reconnect to that sense of accepting my work as good. Because the opposite of accepting, of course, is resisting. I don't want to do this work. So in order to accept it, I need to rethink and reframe the work. The other thing I think to keep in mind is, in a situation like that, is that future orientation. And it's like, if he's going to quit being a baker in, the next 3 to 6 months, well, it's going to be hard to stay very attached to this project, to stay invested in it. But if he can remind himself, you know what, I have an intention to be in this business for a long time. And so part of that is building a good reputation and seeing the long-term fruits and benefits of that. And so just re-anchoring yourself in sort of like, yeah, I intend to be at this for a while. And so doing good work now matters. And that'll help you sort of get through that today. But I admit, we all, as human beings, we kind of can go up and down in terms of how invested we feel in our work, depending on the type of work that it is, how it engages us creatively, how we're doing at home. If we're struggling with family problems and things like that, taking ownership at work can become more difficult. And so that's just one of the challenges of human life, is that, we're invested in a lot of different projects in our lives. I personally am a father, so I'm invested in the lives of my 3 kids. And sometimes they really take a lot out of me. It's hard to maintain enough to give to other projects, and other times they're easier. And so we have to manage our investments. And so, one thing that I like to tell leaders is the goal of inspiring your people to take ownership isn't to get them to overdrive their investment at work at all costs. That's called unhealthy workaholism. When we identify too strongly with our work. And so what we want to do is help people find the balance of not being detached, not being, disengaged, but also not being, this crazy overinvested person in my work where I get all of my identity at work, but rather that kind of this middle ground. There's a philosophical concept called a virtue, which a lot of times we think of like courage, being between being rash, like I just run into anything, and being fearful or a coward. But what's courage? It's in the middle. It's this middle ground. And a lot of things in life are like that. And so I think, as we struggle sometimes to take ownership at work, we need to kind of think about how we can reframe things or reorient ourselves to get us more back in the middle. But then likewise, we don't want to be overinvested in work that our other priorities in life don't matter or fall to the wayside.
Right. It's all about having a good work-life balance, which a lot of people unfortunately do not have, and they do allow themselves to get consumed. However, as a solopreneur, or any type of entrepreneur, I should say, sometimes our work does consume everything that we do because it's our everything. And I'll be honest with you, in my case, working is my everything. I know that sounds sad and a bit overkill, but I've been in this business since late 2016. Maybe, honestly, I could extend that even longer if I want to count when I was just doing this on the side. But sometimes I do feel that I overinvest. I do stay up really late at night working on stuff. I find myself sacrificing some of my weekends to work on projects or to go visit clients. And in the end, it's somewhat easy for me. I'm not married. I don't have any children, so I don't have to worry about the family aspect of it, but it is still a lot to deal with. And in the end, I just want to say that I still allow myself to have some free time regardless of that. I know it does sound like a lot, but I don't allow it to consume me too much to where I don't have free time, because I still have those moments where I will go out and do something that isn't work related just so I can relax and unwind and just get away from it. And the other thing is that sometimes we want to detach ourselves from our work just to take a break, but sometimes our clients don't allow us because they want us to come in on our days off to go help them out with something. I don't mind doing that, honestly, but it is a little bit more respectful when people understand the boundaries and actually respect the business hours. I'm not saying I don't mind going after hours, because I do it all the time. And in fact, I encourage it for some of my clients who work full-time jobs, but I do prefer like when people let me know first. This ensures that I'm still keeping ownership of the project by acknowledging that I am going to get it taken care of. I will set up that appointment to go and see them, but I would like to do it where it's convenient for both of us, because some clients don't understand that maybe I am away at the moment and I can't go visit them at that time.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting point. There's actually quite a bit of literature that has studied employees, and it's typically the burnout sort of literature. But having good boundaries around work hours where you can leave work and come home, and sort of like what you said, that ability to detach sort of as part of this hard to find middle ground is actually really important for at least a lot of people in terms of their longevity at a career. And so it's something to always think about, how to set boundaries, how to make sure that you as an entrepreneur are both taking ownership and delivering what you need to deliver for your clients, but also having those boundaries and that sort of healthy sort of detachment, at least at times, So there's no magic to any of this. It's all very personal, and it depends on what else you've got going on in your life. And, if you don't have kids or family, then you can invest a lot more into work. And then priorities change over the course of a lifespan too. So I think it's really good discussion, and it's really important for people to think about and really to feel freedom to say, no, actually, this will be healthy for me in the long run. If I set a few boundaries today, I won't find myself, completely burnt out in, 5 years. And I've studied a lot of entrepreneurship and listened to a lot of good entrepreneurs too. And one thing that I hear constantly is don't build a business that you don't feel like you can get out of or that you hate in 5 years, So I think that's all real good stuff.
Yeah, that's right. You want to make sure that you are doing something that you're going to enjoy doing. Like they say, when you enjoy your work, it doesn't feel like work. It doesn't feel like you're working at all. It actually feels good. And that's how it's been for me with CDG. Hopefully one day I can end my single days, but I'm in my early 30s and I still haven't met anybody yet. And secondly, I just want your quick opinion on this, please. So basically the way I have things set up is that I have 2 offices, and I don't go to either one of these 2 offices unless I have a client appointment. I do all my work at home otherwise, because why would I want to drive and fight traffic when I can do all my work at home? I got a very powerful computer to do everything I need to do here. But here's the thing, because of that very reason, the moment I get up out of bed, I'm immediately at the office at work, you could say, because this is where I do most of my work. And I only go to the offices whenever I have appointments. So what's your overall opinion on that in terms of my work-life balance and my detachment from work? Because if I don't have any appointments in the middle of a work day and I have something personal or family related I have to take care of, I just go ahead and do it. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a real sense of detachment, because like I said, I am at home working, and I do find myself staying up really late at night working on projects, getting them knocked out, especially if during the day I had to leave to go take care of business in town. And that means I'm on the road for several hours.
Yeah. I don't know that I know you well enough to prescribe something, but do you feel like you would like to create more of a boundary or more of a sense of personal space and workspace?
Right now, I don't really feel like I need it. However, if I ever get married, I will really have to reconsider those boundaries. I will say that.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the psychological literature would say that place matters, and that places are associated with all sorts of things, memories and just sort of atmospheres and environments, and like where we are can really matter. And so if you ever did feel like, yeah, I'd like to create some more boundaries around, home and work, going into the office is great. But I mean, at the same time, I think post-pandemic, there's lots and lots of people that have made home offices successful, and your kind of home office room is your room to work, and then you walk out the door and then you're back home. So I don't know. I don't think there's any right answer necessarily, but if you felt the need, well, I'd like to have more space from me and the job, that's certainly something you could try.
Right. And like I said, it's something that I will definitely be refining over time, because right now I don't have anyone special in my life that I share my life with. So if I were married, everything I explained would be much different. Yes, I would be looking for more free time, but honestly, I feel like maybe work is consuming my life simply because I am single. I feel like I'm allowing it to consume my life because it's really all I've gotten. It's a very pathetic thing for me to say, but that's a different discussion for a different episode.
Christian, let's reframe it. I don't think that that's pathetic. I think it's self-aware. And the only way that you're going to make changes is through self-awareness. So I think it's great. And if you're sensing that, I mean, it could be self-fulfilling in the sense that, if work consumes your life, well, you're not maybe engaged in other sorts of social activities if you do have that desire to meet other people that you might otherwise would have. And so maybe creating some more boundaries could be healthy for you as a whole person, not just as an entrepreneur. So I don't think there's any shame in working hard at all, but you just have to have self-awareness to take a step back and reevaluate. In this season where I'm at now, maybe you've got your business kind of more established and you're ready to not focus quite so much, and that can be healthy. So
you're right. That's a great way of reframing my perspective, and I 100% agree with with it. And looks like I have some homework to do in terms of how I'm going to be changing that up. With that being said, we've talked about a lot of different examples. We've shared a lot of different tips and key points to help people really reframe their mindset in general. But now I want to share with you another real world example that I have about micromanaging. So in your book, you discussed how micromanaging is one of the 5 biggest killers of generating a sense of ownership. And as soon as I read that, I was able to easily relate to that. So
people can.
right. And it's why I'm in business for myself now, so I don't have to deal with it anymore. Now, I would love your professional opinion about this story. So at the very last job that I had before I started CDG, I worked for this small company. I'm not going to say what it's called or what they did just for safety reasons, but they hired me initially to do some graphic design work. They needed some business cards, a retractable banner, and a few other little things. So they hired me as a graphic designer. I went and took the job, and it was kind of a bait and switch. The reason why I say that is because as soon as they were done with all their graphics needs, they basically had me being their assistant to where I had to watch the front desk. I was a receptionist. I had to answer phone calls. I had to do all the filing, and I also had to go run errands for the company, like going to buy the boss's food or taking certain checks for him to the bank and things like that. There was this one moment where they were talking about getting their website done because they had a horrible looking unprofessional website that was designed in Weebly, most likely designed by the boss himself or someone he knew. I don't know. So here I was getting ready to take ownership of this project. And it was hard for me to take ownership of any of these other projects of what a drag these guys were to work for. But he had an office manager who was always nitpicking every single little thing you could think of. And I mean everything. The office manager was a drag to work for. So he was also involved in the supervision process of getting a new website. So I explained at least twice what needed to be done. And one of the things that needed to be done was we needed to get WordPress. So I took ownership of the project in a sense of pointing what direction it needed to go in. But what I didn't have was access to actually start this project, access to the hosting side of things. After mentioning to them twice that we needed to get a nice professional looking WordPress site installed, the office manager just got really heated. He got rude. He's like, Christian, I already told you we can't do WordPress. We have to use the Weebly. So why do you keep bringing it up? I keep bringing it up because they always ask me what needs to be done better. That's why I brought it up so many times. They've asked me what work the website needed to be done in the past. And now that I've answered this question a second time, the guy decides to blow his top. And on top of that, this is just the office manager. He's not even my real boss. I actually had to tell my actual boss that his office manager was just rude, micromanaging, nitpicking. I mean, when I say micromanaging, here's another example. I remember one time I put a ream of computer paper on the shelf in an unorganized shelf in their closet. This shelf had no order. It was already a big mess. I put it in a spot other than its original place. Then this office manager makes me stop the project I'm working on at my desk to go into that room. He wants to tell me something. And you know what he tells me? He's like, the paper's supposed to go over here. I told him it doesn't really matter. And I tried to point out that there was never really a defined place for it. And then he goes, it goes here. And I just put it there just to get him to shut up. But I thought that was crazy. And then I got a more extreme example. I remember one time I went to work and I stopped in the restroom. Stopping in the restroom caused me to be at least maybe 5 minutes late or so. So no big deal. But when I come in, he wants to know where I'm at. And I told him I stopped in the restroom. He goes, the restroom's not part of our office. And then I told him, yeah, I had to go in there. So he starts making a big deal out of it as if I had arrived 30 minutes late instead of like 5 minutes late. Then he's like, the restroom's not part of our office. And then me and him get into a very heated exchange. And I had to tell him, there's nothing wrong with what I did. It's not like it's the end of the world. I told him, you're making a much bigger deal out of this than it should be. And then I brought up the point that I don't get paid on time. That was another issue. The boss never paid us on time to begin with. So that was another deal. This boss never paid us on time to begin with. And the office manager was in charge of accounting. So here he is nitpicking that I just came in a few minutes after my usual time because I stopped in the restroom. Hey, nature calls, right? And then on top of that, they're unprofessional because they don't pay us on time. Other coworkers have told me that their biggest gripe was that they weren't getting paid on time. And it's the reason why a lot of people were leaving. And then he just made a really big deal about it. And then we eventually sat down and talked about it. And then I've got one more other example that was pretty extreme too. One thing that I always did when I arrived at work every day was heat up the tea kettle and get some hot water for everybody because everybody in that office drank tea every morning. So it was part of my job to make sure the water was prepared too. So I did that. So I prepared a nice big kettle of tea. You know, they had an electric kettle. I filled it up with water. And then he came in, he grabbed the kettle and he dumped all the water out. And then he's like, no, that's too much water. I told him, y'all drink a lot of tea every day. Y'all need a lot of water. Otherwise, you're just going to be making more. And then he goes, Christian, I'm always right about everything. You don't need to argue with me, or something along those lines. I don't remember the exact term, but that actually made me really upset because I was just trying to help, and he rudely came in, told me off, and dumped all that water out. And the cherry on top was the fact that he said, I'm always right about everything. He basically told me that I am never to question him. He is in charge, and my job is just to shut up, obey him, and do what I'm told.
Mm-hmm. So can you formulate a question for me?
Well, it's not really more of a question, but more of me just sharing the experience with you and showing you that throughout all these examples, it was hard to take ownership of anything because the office manager was too domineering. Now, my boss himself, he had his own faults, but he wasn't micromanaging me like his office manager was. I had to go to my boss, tell him how rude and disrespectful the office manager was. And guess what my boss told me? He told me, yeah, he's rude to me too. And then that's when we decided that we needed to start basically some job framing. He decided that he wanted to make sure that my office manager was not as involved in what I was doing anymore because it was creating all these problems. But the main point of this that I want to share with you was the fact that he was domineering, he was narcissistic, he basically wanted me to believe that he was always right and never to be questioned. And as a result, all of the decisions that I made where I took ownership were outright killed. And every day just going to work felt like a drag. Like it got to the point to where I had enough of this. The office manager eventually quit long before I left, but that doesn't mean that the environment still wasn't bad. There was no sense of generating ownership. There was no sense of truly having pride in your work. It was basically just shut up, do what you're told. I'm always right. That's why I wanted to share this with you, because I just couldn't take ownership of anything. And even when I did, it was either killed or I just felt like that I was just contributing to an overall toxic environment where I was just making my boss rich and not really making customers satisfied, because he did have customers who weren't happy with their services too.
Yeah, that does sound like a pretty bad work environment. I'm sorry you had to go through that. You started out the conversation sort of with the question of micromanagement as being one of the top 5 ownership killers, which it is. And, in thinking about micromanagement, obviously we can coach leaders to say, well, if you want to inspire ownership in your employees, don't micromanage. And it sounds simple, but it's actually more difficult than you think. And there's kind of like a nuanced approach that managers really need to take with employees, because not everybody is going to be at the same level of competence for every task. And so there's some great work done by Ken Blanchard on servant leadership. And he talks a lot about that, how we need to adapt our leadership style based on an employee's, both their commitment to their work and their competence in their work. That can differ even on different types of tasks. The first thing that is always a failure in micromanagement situations is a failure to set clear expectations. So I'm sure if you had been, let's take the paper example. I mean, it's a kind of a silly one, but it's also a big deal at the same time. So I'm sure if you had been taken around day, 1 to 10 of the new work, and it was like, here's the expectation, here's all our paper, this is where the paper goes, and here's where the pens go, and that was a clear expectation that had been set, then you would have probably just performed to that expectation. A lot of times where micromanagement tendencies get cultivated is that managers fail to take the time to actually think through what the expectations actually are for either a given task or a given project. I mean, if you're dealing with people developing websites, I'm sure you've had this happen where the expectation is something super vague, like, we want a professional website that can give a lead magnet and contact form and, a few things like that. But it's kind of vague. And so you go off and you work on it, and what you deliver back doesn't meet their expectations. And so now they're like, okay, well, now I need to micromanage this more. And so whereas if a manager will start by taking the time to really develop a set of clear expectations, then that can really function as guardrails and guidelines where an employee can then go and take ownership within the project. But the micromanagement tendency comes out when if I don't set clear expectations and then the work product that I get back doesn't meet my expectations that weren't really set in the first place, or they weren't at least communicated, then I start to feel like, oh, I can't trust this employee. Oh, now I have to provide them more supervision. Oh, now I need to go get metal, get in the weeds more. And then that becomes like a self-fulfilling loop. And so then the employee gets frustrated and says, eventually, if you go down this loop too many times, the employee is going to be like, well, I'm not going to take any creative liberty with this anyway, because I know a boss is just going to come micromanage whatever they want me to do anyway. Oh, the font's too big, or oh, the color's wrong, or oh, the, whatever. Well, if we just set good expectations up front, I mean, that's the first step to curing micromanagement from a leadership standpoint. The second step is really diagnosing the level of competence and commitment of the employee. So, the more competent they are and the more committed they are to a project, then the more you can just delegate. If you have a new employee who's been on the job a month or whatever, just quote unquote delegating, which we all think is a great trait in a leader, which it is at some level, but there's nuance, right? You don't take somebody that has no competence in a particular area and then just delegate to them. No, that kind of person needs more coaching. They need maybe even some more, minutia level directing, at least the first time they do a project or the first time they do a task or a process or whatever it is. And so in any conversation of micromanagement, the idea of setting expectations is super important. The idea of diagnosing the development level of the employee, both in terms of their commitment and their competence, is also important because, you could have a highly competent employee too, but who's not really committed, who's not really taking ownership and that kind of thing. You're going to have to approach them differently. So that it's kind of like a matrix. And then the last thing, after you've sort of adapted your leadership style to each person in their situation, is you have to be comfortable with allowing people to grow and make mistakes. So to lead in a way that you're not overbearing, you're not micromanaging, you have to get comfortable with the fact that some mistakes are going to get made, but have a long-term view of your employee and recognize that that's where real learning often happens, is through the mistakes that are made. I'll never forget, there was a company I was working for as a client that is a builder, and they build big things like big hospitals, big multi-unit, multi-family apartment complexes, schools, things like that. And there was a new foreman that they had. And one of the managers, who was a pretty seasoned leader, he saw this guy kind of like going down a path that, if it was for sure going to fail, like he would have probably jumped in, but it was kind of questionable. So he let him sort of do his thing. Ultimately, that path was kind of a mistake. And it was about $100,000 mistake. And when I first heard that number and this guy was telling the story, I was like, ooh, that's a pretty big mistake. He's like, yeah. He's like, but I let him make it because I know down the road that's going to prevent him from making a $5 million mistake. And so that comfort of, to get out of micromanagement, we've got to have some comfort with people making some mistakes and then coaching them afterwards and coaching them through that. So that's kind of what I have to say about that. I know that doesn't totally address all of the different instances that you sort of brought up, which were all, really, really valid and good instances of ways that micromanaging just kind of sucks as the person who's being micromanaged. And I know everyone listening to this podcast has experienced that. And so one of the things that we want to do as we grow our companies and become CEOs and leaders and entrepreneurs is take the time to think through, how are we finding that balance between guiding, directing, coaching, and then ultimately supporting and just delegating work to people and understanding, okay, yeah, there's a continuum here and I need to help grow my people and make sure that I don't stay in a place of where I'm, viewed as the micromanager.
And Ryan, for some people, I've said this many times before, basically, for some people, I always tell them, you give them a little bit of power and they start to think they own the world. And people who are like this, these are usually your micromanagers, your power trippers, just your authoritarians. And these people have no business being in power. That's how I would sum that up. People need to be very careful. If they want to be a leader, they do need to know how to be a good leader, where they are setting examples. They are encouraging all of their subordinates to take ownership for their work, and they're not just nitpicking them or yelling at them over every single little thing. My previous boss that I had, the one that I mentioned at the beginning of the show with the inventory, I remember when I first started working for him, the first thing he told me my first or second day was, when I asked him, are you going to show me how to do anything? He told me, nope, I'm throwing you in the crap hole and it's up to you to crawl your way back out. And that basically broke that big rule that you just told me leaders should never break.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not a good approach. I agree.
No, not at all. Yeah, all these people are toxic, and I'm glad that I learned by example of how not to lead in the future. And I've also learned a lot of things about how to run a business. So, Matt, I would like to conclude this episode with one final question, and that is, what is some important advice that you can share for those out there who want to start a business or already in the game? So if you had one piece of general advice for the entrepreneurship and small business world that's very general, what would it be?
I think the ability to stay focused. I love the acronym FOCUS, which you can spell out as follow one course until successful. And I think that is just key, especially for new entrepreneurs. I think we all that are in this game have a little bit of the shiny object syndrome, and we can, want to stop what we're doing and go investigate something else or get distracted by something else or hope that something else will work better. And so I guess, if you wanted to tie it to ownership, I guess it's like really own the one thing that you can do well, because until you've achieved mastery at that and success at that, then is the time to then go iterate and look at other stuff. So I know that's been something I've struggled with personally, is staying focused. And I think it's just something that we all have to keep owning, the one thing that we have chosen already to do for good reasons. So
very well said. And I'm not going to forget your acronym for focus. That's the first time I've heard of it, and I think I might actually make that into a poster. But yes, thank you for coming on BizCast. It's been a pleasure meeting you and getting to learn all sorts of new things about ownership. I enjoyed your book. Please tell our listeners, where can they go to purchase your book?
Oh yeah, the book is available on Amazon and anywhere you can buy books, Barnes & Noble, all those kind of things. Also, if you go to the website ownershipunlock.com/free gift, there's a free gift there, which is a reflection and action guide on how to apply these principles that are in the book to your own leadership. You can also go to matthewfwilson.com and download the first 3 chapters for free if you want to just kind of check it out before making a purchase. But yeah, it's available everywhere.
Thank you for sharing that information. I encourage all of our listeners to go and check out the book and learn how to truly take ownership of your work. Learn that you're not just going to work every day just to get a paycheck. Everyone's job is important to the entire organization's purpose as a whole. No matter how small or large your role is, no matter how small or large your job is, never forget that and always have that mindset of knowing that your work does not go unnoticed. Leaders, remember to foster that sense of everything being ours, not just mine. Thanks again, Matt. We certainly look forward to having you again on BizCast one day soon, and we hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. It's been an honor to be here, and I wish you all success.